From famine to fears over digital surveillance, tonight we look at some of the top stories from around the world. Welcome to Faith Nation in Washington. I'm John Jessup. Ukraine, often referred to as the world's breadbasket, accounted for 10% of global wheat exports in 2021. Although tens of millions of metric tons were planted for harvesting this season, Russia's war is putting current crops in jeopardy. And that means more than 300 million people in the world's poorest countries soon could be facing acute hunger. CBN contributor Chuck Holton explains.
The Russian invasion has everyone focused on mere survival, and the fighting will likely ensure much of this wheat never gets harvested. And the wheat stored in these silos near Odessa can't make it to market because of Russia's blockade of ports on the Black Sea. That bodes poorly for many countries that rely on Ukrainian wheat for survival. In Lebanon, it's estimated the country will be out of grain in less than 2 months.
The impact of the Ukraine war on Lebanon is going to be unfortunately multifaceted, and we've seen that already, not only in the wheat supply that's coming into the country, but even calls to our hotline for families looking for extra support. Normally, UNICEF supports 130,000 children every month with a small cash grant of $40 US. And in recent weeks, the number of calls to our helpline has more than tripled as families have really struggled to put food on the table.
And in Egypt, more than 80% of the 270 million loaves of bread the country consumes each day are made with wheat from Russia and Ukraine. So here, people see big problems on the horizon. In Cairo, people on a fixed income are already feeling the pinch of high prices.
The bread in Egypt is like the backbone because most of the people need bread to eat. And the point is the price for the bread went up. Some here for the bakery doesn't make much more like before. He came to make less number of breads. So now if you have to get like 10 pieces, you got just 5. The bread came to be 30% more, which is like 65, 70 piastres per piece, and in somewhere it can be £1 one piece.
Food security has always been extremely important here in the desert in Egypt. This granary beside me, some people believe, was built by Joseph from the Bible in the 7 fat years that Egypt had before the 7 lean years, where they stored up grain and then sold it to the entire world. And they believe that the money that they gained from all of that grain enabled them to build some of the biggest monuments in the world, including the Great Pyramid.
But today, Egypt is much less prepared for what looks to be lean years ahead. To counter this, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has demanded the nation's farmers dedicate a portion of their land to growing wheat. Those who fail to produce their quota face fines and possible jail time. This Egyptian farmer says threats aren't necessary.
I'm happy to grow more wheat this year because the prices are much higher. I've already sold all my winter crop and it will give my family a good life.
Any added grain grown by local farmers, though, won't come close to making up the shortfall from Ukraine. For that reason, Egyptians are cutting back already and blaming Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, the flour also here get really more expensive because it's a crazy Russian government. He's crazy.
From Cairo, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Thanks, Chuck. And among the thousands of Jews who fled the war in Ukraine, some actually happen to be survivors of the Holocaust. Those Ukrainian Jewish refugees are hoping to make a new home in Israel. Chris Mitchell brings us their story.
Ukrainians forced to flee their homes because of war. Some of them Holocaust survivors, and others fleeing for a second time.
You can imagine the atmosphere, nervous tension, and an unpredictable destiny. What can one expect other than being murdered?
Almost all the buildings around us burned down. When a mortar hits a building, it starts a fire, and there are no means to extinguish it. There is no water in the city.
While a nightmare for many fleeing Ukrainians, these Jewish refugees have a unique hope for the future.
You heard in the borders, when the Jewish community waiting for people there, and there's buses, and they know where they're going to live, and they know that Israel is helping them to come. It's like, if already to be a refugee, it's better to be a Jewish refugee.
The Israeli government and Jewish organizations are banding together to make it possible. Alona Grosu of the Jewish community of Moldova says when they heard about the war, they knew the world would never be the same.
So from this day, we've started organizing a rescue operation for the members of Jewish communities from Ukraine.
Overnight, the municipality in Chisinau, Moldova, opened its tennis center as a place for fleeing refugees, and the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews stepped in to help.
With the Jewish community, with the Joint, with all the organization, we built an opportunity to have places for the people to sleep, to eat, to be in a safe, warm place.
More than 10,000 eligible Ukrainians have immigrated to Israel since the war began. They are fleeing Ukraine through Poland, Hungary, Romania, and about a third escaped through Moldova. From the border, these refugees are taken either to the Israeli consulate or the Hub Tennis Center, where the Jewish agency determines their eligibility to immigrate to Israel. The Foreign Ministry provides them with papers, and the IFCJ books them on charter flights. That's where CBN News met Ludmila Polonova, her mother Tetiana, and 16-year-old son, Andrei.
It's a catastrophe. It was a miracle that we were able to leave Mariupol now. On March 12th, an aircraft bomb fell next to our house. All the windows, glass, window frames, and doors were shattered. It was impossible to stay in the apartment.
Ludmila and her family lived in the basement for a week.
We left thanks to my son. We found out that in the 9th-story building next door, there was a phone reception on the 9th floor. My son remembered that his classmate lived in the neighboring town of Mangush, and her father owned a minibus. My son ran to the 9th floor, called her, and her father took us out the very next day.
It wasn't the first time this family had to escape. They fled the Donetsk region in 2014. This time, they have a different outlook.
We expect some kind of well-being, a peaceful life. I want a future for my son.
I hope everything will go well in Israel. It's hard to move, of course. All my friends are in Ukraine. But at least there will be peace in Israel.
I think Israel is our salvation, and I think everything will go well for us.
Until their departure, refugees are housed at places like this guest house outside Chisinau. Holocaust survivor Zinovy Lakarev came here after he turned 86 on March 16th.
I didn't have a birthday. There was bombing and shelling. That's why I was at home. 2 rocket explosions happened about 50 to 60 meters from our house. These were frightful explosions. Everything shook. The entire 9-story building was shaking. That's when I decided to leave.
It brought back haunting memories.
In September 1941, under bombing and shelling of the trains we were in, we left the city. We returned to Kharkiv in March of 1944.
And 78 years later, with just a plastic bag in hand, Zinovy was on the run again. This time he has 2 daughters, 2 granddaughters, and a great-granddaughter waiting for him in Israel.
I'm very happy that I'm finally going to leave this hell. But it's very unpleasant and heavy for me.
When the hotels and guest houses were full, the Jewish community and volunteers opened this warehouse, where we met Vera Chimra. She also recalled her first time having to leave everything behind.
My first evacuation took place 81 years ago in 1941. I remember a freight car. There was a transit camp like this, only this one is comfortable. Back then, the only thing we had was a blanket.
Vera returned to Kharkiv after World War II and stayed put until now.
I feel more cheerful. I'm able to move again. Before, I stopped moving. I had COVID with bad complications. My leg was paralyzed. I couldn't even imagine that I'd travel such distances as I didn't leave the house for half a year.
So far, the IFCJ has helped more than 2,200 refugees fly to Israel from Moldova since the war started. But it's not a regular aliyah. Benny Haddad says they usually have a chance to prepare new immigrants before they come.
You're touching the people for 2 seconds. They're coming here, they want as much as faster to be there because they live as refugees here without anything. And the main goal is to send them to Israel and save them from here.
Zinovi and Ludmila, Tetiana and Andre were among 112 new immigrants and 9 pets CBN News joined on the 3-hour flight back to Israel. At the Kishinev airport, they were Ukrainian refugees, but within hours, they became citizens of Israel, fulfilling biblical prophecy.
We don't comprehend it yet.
Thank God there's no shooting. I hope I'll never hear it again. At my age, it's a new beginning. At this age, people hang up their fiddle completely, but I decided to change everything from the start.
That was the first day of their new adventure as Israelis. It may not be easy here, but they be planted in the land of their forefathers and should never have to run away again. Chris Mitchell, CBN News.
Thank you, Chris. When we come back, the push for digital identities, protecting against fraud, or the precursor to a surveillance state. Next on Faith Nation. Well, welcome back. Imagine a state where the government keeps tabs on everywhere you go, everything you say, and everything you buy through a digital identity. Might sound like the communist regime in China, but the European Union may be headed in the same direction. And as Dale Hurd reports, the idea is actually gaining ground in the United States Congress.
Is the European Union on its way to becoming a surveillance society like China?
The European Digital Identity.
This cheery introduction to the EU's upcoming digital identity program tells citizens that it will make their lives easier while keeping them safer online.
The European Digital Identity Wallets will enable us to store and exchange documents and legal information while fully controlling which data we want to share with whom.
ID data sent.
EU President Ursula von der Leyen says digital identities will give citizens control over how their personal data is used and will help stop identity theft. The so-called digital wallet will be an app on a person's phone and will contain only the information a person wants it to include, such as medical or financial information.
Credit rating sent. Income statement sent.
It's already under attack in the European Parliament as something that would be ripe for government abuse. One of its chief critics, European Parliament member Christian Turres, was born in communist Romania and has long been warning of the EU's so-called Chinification.
Clearly, we are witnessing right now the Chinification of Europe, because we see what is happening in China right now with the social credit score, where the government is monitoring and surveilling all the people from the beginning to end. Everything that they do, everything, everywhere where they walk, they control everything and they watch everything. This is the example of a tyranny.
The EU insists the digital identity program will be voluntary. Skeptics are wondering how long before it becomes mandatory.
How voluntary is the European Digital Identity Wallet? But even more important, how voluntary will it remain in the future? Because the European Union always comes up with nice plans to eventually abuse it, to create more control.
The EU's COVID passport was supposed to be temporary. Now Brussels wants to extend it until at least June of next year. COVID passports have been used to prevent the unvaccinated from crossing borders, entering grocery stores, using public transit, and even going to their jobs. It's helped fuel violent demonstrations, the likes of which Europe hasn't seen for decades. Some in Washington are urging Joe Biden to establish digital identities for Americans as a way of fighting identity theft. There's also support in Congress. The so-called Improving Digital Identity Act of 2020 never made it to a vote, but could be revived. We asked an expert on digital identities if they are indeed a necessary safeguard against identity theft. The director of engineering at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Alexis Hancock, not only said no, but said digital IDs are more likely to encourage identity theft.
I think this actually increases the attack vector. This makes you a bigger target in my eyes, especially if in a government issue digital identity. When you have something on the internet for a long time, there's an increased potential of it being breached in some fashion because of this long-term storage. And when you're able to associate something like that with a particular person, you can pivot from that long-term identifier to other information about them and compromise, say, your bank accounts or compromise some sort of information about you.
Not only are digital IDs coming to Europe, but in Italy, the cities of Rome and Bologna have begun social credit programs that reward citizens for behavior that officials think will fight climate change, like using a bicycle instead of a car. A social credit system could be easily incorporated into a digital identity. Austrian Catholic leader Alexander Chukwuel says that in any European social credit system, Christians will lose because of their opposition to issues like abortion that the EU views as a human right.
Therefore, I do not want the European Union to have the possibility to look into everything I do, everything I say, everything I have, and how I move and where I am at any time. Those systems are pushed by people who are highly anti-Christian.
Torres warns that the EU's new digital ID is the next step in a process in which the government in Brussels will micromanage every aspect of people's lives.
This is what makes the difference between a tyranny and democracy. When you know everything about what your government does, that's democracy. When the government knows everything about you, that is tyranny.
Dale Hurd, CBN News.
The new blame game, why some say a new United Nations report is biased against Israel. Welcome back. We turn now to the Middle East and tensions in Israel. The United Nations Human Rights Council has released a report on the Jewish state condemned as biased. It examines last year's war between Israel and Hamas. Once again, here's Chris Mitchell from Jerusalem.
After last year's 11-day war, the UN Human Rights Council established a commission to investigate the conflict, although its mandate went much broader.
It's unprecedented in terms of scope, in terms of geographic location, and most significantly in terms of timing. It's meant to look at the root causes of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict stemming from the war last May, but it is something that can go back to before 1948 when Israel was established and in perpetuity into the future as well.
The 18-page report delves into the overall Israeli-Palestinian conflict and concludes by placing the blame on Israel. It states that the findings and recommendations relevant to the underlying root causes were overwhelmingly directed towards Israel, and the report therefore reflects this. Even though Hamas and other terror groups fired more than 4,000 rockets into Israel, the report cites Hamas only 3 times and Israel 157. There is also no mention of Iran, which funded and armed Hamas during the war.
We love Hamas! We love Hamas!
At the Geneva UN headquarters, Israeli attorney Nitzana Darshan-Leitner led a demonstration against the report.
To come and expose the real face of the Human Rights Council of the UN, compare them to not other but terrorists. In the end of the day, both the UN Council and the terror organization have the same goal, to destroy the state of Israel. The UN is using diplomatic means, fake reports, blood libels, and the terror organization using military means, terror attacks and missiles against Israel.
Darshan-Leitner says the council has 10 agendas, and one is devoted just to Israel. Its commission of inquiry is unique among all other UN bodies, since it's mandated to release an annual report on the Jewish state.
They want to essentially employ what is a form of lawfare, using international law as a political means to delegitimize and attack the state of Israel.
The International Legal Forum, along with 25 other organizations, released a report singling out the head of the commission.
You know, Navi Pillay has already accused Israel of apartheid, of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, and this is the woman that is meant to be adjudicating our supposed guilt or innocence.
The report is expected to be voted on by the UN General Assembly to accept or reject the report during its fall session, and it may be sent to the International Criminal Court. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
All right, thank you, Chris. The state of religious freedom around the world when Faith Nation returns. Finally tonight, the State Department recently released its new findings on international religious freedom. The annual update covers the status of the fundamental right in nearly 200 foreign countries, and this year's release highlights worldwide progress in the expansion of religious freedom, like Iraq's first invitation to the Pope to visit the country. CBN White House correspondent Abigail Robertson reports.
This year's release opened on a positive note, highlighting certain progress worldwide in the expansion of religious freedom, like Iraq's first invitation to the Pope to visit the country.
This report is about spreading that kind of progress to more parts of the world.
Secretary of State Blinken sees the impact of the historic papal visit as profound.
He sent a message not only to Iraqis, but to the whole world, that Islam and other religions can sit together peacefully.
Still, the report reveals much work to be done, calling out many repeat offenders like China for religious freedom violations.
China continues its genocide and repression of predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and other religious minority groups. Since April 2017, more than 1 million Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and others have been detained in internment camps in Xinjiang.
International Religious Freedom Ambassador Rashad Hussain claims Russia has doubled down on violations since invading Ukraine in March.
President Putin sought to justify the unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine through the blatantly false pretext of denazification.
The report also highlighted how religious freedom has deteriorated since the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan in 2021.
The Taliban regime and rival militant group ISIS-K have detained, intimidated, threatened, and attacked members of religious minority communities.
Hussain says thanks to technology and social media, the U.S. has more allies helping combat religious freedom violators than ever before.
We have mechanisms to shed light on abuses taking place, and we have the means to hold bad actors accountable.
Secretary Blinken and Ambassador Hussain both emphasized America's commitment to protecting and advancing religious freedom rights around the world and urged foreign governments to speak out and protect the most vulnerable. Reporting from Washington, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
Thank you, Abby, and we will continue to cover important stories like these right here at CBN News. That does it for tonight's edition of Faith Nation. We'll see you right back here next time.